The Ancient Song of Bread, a bedtime journey through time. Asterisk settle in, dear listener, as we embark on a gentle voyage through time, following the golden thread of bread as it weaves through human history. Close your eyes and let your mind drift across millennia, where the simple act of turning grain into sustenance became one of humanity's most enduring stories. Asterisk. The dawn of fire and grain. In the hushed twilight of prehistory, when the world was younger and wilder, our ancestors wandered beneath star-filled skies that had witnessed the birth of mountains and the slow dance of continents. It was perhaps 30,000 years ago, in the gentle valleys of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, that a remarkable discovery was made, one that would echo through every generation that followed. Picture, if you will, a small band of hunter-gatherers, their hands stained with the juice of wild berries, their eyes keen from years of reading the subtle language of the natural world. They had learned to recognize the golden waves of wild einkorn wheat and emmer that carpeted the hillsides each spring, their heavy heads nodding in the warm breeze like nature's own blessing. At first, these ancient people simply chewed the raw kernels, grinding them between their teeth, tasting the nutty sweetness that would one day become the foundation of civilization. But human ingenuity, like a quiet river, always finds its way forward. Someone, perhaps a woman whose name is lost to time but whose legacy lives in every loaf, discovered that these hard seeds could be crushed between stones, creating a coarse powder that mixed with water to form a paste. The transformation was magical. When this primitive dough was placed upon flat, sun-warmed stones near the dancing flames of their fires, it hardened into something new, a flat, sturdy cake that could be stored, carried, and shared. This was humanity's first bread, simple as morning dew yet revolutionary as the sunrise itself. Sleep well, and dream of golden fields of grain swaying in the wind, of warm kitchens filled with the aroma of fresh bread, of the countless bakers who have kept this ancient tradition alive through all the centuries of human history. In their dedication to this simple craft, we find the dedication of humanity itself, always striving, always creating, always finding new ways to transform the raw materials of existence into something nourishing, something beautiful, something that feeds not just our bodies but our souls. The ancient song of bread continues, and we are all part of its eternal melody. In the end, bread teaches us that the simplest things are often the most profound. For ingredients, flour, water, salt, and time combined with human care and attention, create something that has sustained our species for millennia. In a world that often seems to value complexity over simplicity, speed over patience, and convenience over craft, bread reminds us of different values. The universal human connection to bread transcends all the boundaries that divide us. Rich and poor, young and old, from every culture and faith, we all share this fundamental need, this basic satisfaction. In the breaking of bread, we find not just nourishment for our bodies, but food for our souls, connection to our past, and hope for our future. So as you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of this ancient story, remember that you are part of bread's continuing tale. Every meal you share, every loaf you break, every moment you spend gathered around a table with others, you are participating in the eternal human story of sustenance, community, and love. The bread that will be baked tomorrow morning by bakers around the world will be part of the same unbroken chain that stretches back to the first loaf ever made. And in that continuity, in that endless cycle of mixing and rising, shaping and baking, we find one of humanity's most beautiful truths, that some things transcend time, that some needs never change, and that some simple acts of love and care can connect us across all the ages of the world. In our modern age, when so much of our food comes from distant places and unknown hands, bread making offers a return to something fundamental and true. The sourdough starter bubbling on the kitchen counter, the loaves cooling on the rack, the incomparable aroma of fresh bread filling the home. These simple pleasures connect us to the deepest sources of human satisfaction. The recent resurgence of interest in traditional bread making speaks to something profound in the human spirit. In a world of increasing complexity and technological dependence, the simple act of making bread by hand offers a form of meditation. a way of engaging with the physical world that satisfies both body and soul. It reminds us that some of the most important human activities are also the simplest, nourishing ourselves and those we love. As we look toward the future, bread's story continues to unfold. New techniques will be developed, new ingredients discovered, new traditions born from the marriage of old wisdom and new understanding. Climate change will bring new challenges, requiring adaptation and innovation. Changing dietary needs will drive new forms of bread making. But through all these changes, the fundamental human relationship with bread will endure. The child who helps grandmother knead dough in the kitchen, the teenager who learns to make his first loaf, the adult who returns to bread making in times of stress or celebration. They are all participating in humanity's longest-running tradition. They are adding their own chapter to the story that began when the first human picked up a handful of grain and imagined something more. The languages of the world are rich with expressions that reveal bread's central place in human consciousness. We speak of breaking bread with friends, acknowledging that sharing food creates bonds deeper than mere acquaintance. We ask for our daily bread, recognizing that this simple food represents all of life's necessities. We call someone the breadwinner, understanding that the ability to provide bread is the foundation of family security. In the Christian tradition, bread becomes the body of Christ, transforming the everyday into the sacred. In Jewish households, Halal marks the Sabbath, elevating the weekly rhythm of rest and renewal. In Muslim communities, the breaking of bread ends the daily fast during Ramadan, making sustenance a celebration. These religious traditions recognize what humans have always known intuitively. Bread is never just bread. It is communion, connection, and continuation. The miracle of bread lies not just in its transformation from grain to loaf, but in its ability to transform us. The act of making bread, mixing flour and water, kneading dough, waiting for fermentation, shaping loaves, tending the fire, connects us to the fundamental rhythms of life. It teaches patience in an age of instant gratification, mindfulness in an era of distraction, and humility in the face of natural processes that cannot be rushed or controlled. Every culture that has ever existed has developed its own relationship with bread, yet the fundamental human need it satisfies remains constant. The Ethiopian mother tearing injera to share with her family, the French baker pulling golden baguettes from his oven, the Indian woman rolling chapati on her griddle, the Mexican grandmother making fresh tortillas. They are all part of the same eternal story, participants in the same ancient dance between human need and human ingenuity. In the pre-dawn darkness of bakeries around the world, as it has been for thousands of years, bakers still rise before the sun to begin their ancient work. Their hands, whether in Tokyo or Toledo, Mumbai or Montreal, perform the same fundamental gestures that have nourished humanity since the first wild grains were ground between stones. The mixing, the kneading, the patient waiting for fermentation to work its quiet magic. These actions transcend time and place, connecting the modern baker to every baker who has ever lived. Consider the remarkable journey we have traveled together. From those first hunter-gatherers who discovered that crushed grain and water could become something greater than the sum of their parts, to the Egyptian bakers who captured wild yeast and learned to make bread rise, to the Roman engineers who built ovens that could feed an empire, to the medieval guilds that preserved ancient knowledge through dark ages, to the industrial revolution that made bread available to millions, to the modern artisans who labored to keep traditional techniques alive. Throughout this epic journey, bread has been witness to humanity's greatest triumphs and deepest sorrows. It has been present at celebrations and funerals, at the tables of kings, and in the hands of beggars. It has been currency and comfort, symbol and sustenance. Wars have been fought over it, revolutions sparked by its absence, and communities built around its production. Climate change also began to influence bread making in the 21st century. As weather patterns shifted and traditional growing regions faced new challenges, bakers and farmers worked together to develop new varieties of grain that could thrive in changing conditions while maintaining the qualities that made great bread possible. The artisan bread movement that had begun in the 1980s reached full flower in the new millennium. Bakeries that emphasized traditional techniques, local ingredients, and small batch production could be found in cities around the world. These bakers, often working with nothing more than flour, water, salt, and time, created breads that rivaled the best of any era. Yet even as traditional techniques experienced a renaissance, innovation continued. Bakers experimented with new fermentation methods, explored ancient grains, and developed techniques that had never been tried before. The tension between tradition and innovation that had characterized bread making for centuries continued to drive the craft forward. The Eternal Loaf, Reflections on Bread's Universal Song. As our journey through bread's history draws to a close, like the gentle settling of dough that has finished its rise, we find ourselves in a quiet moment of reflection. The soft light of understanding illuminates the simple truth that has sustained humanity through every age. Bread is more than sustenance. It is the golden thread that connects us all, weaving through time and across cultures, binding us to our ancestors and to each other. The internet age transformed bread making in ways that medieval guild masters could never have imagined. Home bakers, inspired by videos and blogs, began maintaining sourdough starters and baking their own loaves. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 accelerated this trend dramatically, as people confined to their homes rediscovered the meditative pleasure of bread making. Flour disappeared from grocery store shelves as millions of people simultaneously decided to try their hand at this ancient craft. Social media platforms became virtual bakeries where bakers shared their successes and failures, their techniques and innovations. The community that had once been limited to local guilds now spanned the globe, connecting sourdough enthusiasts in Sweden with non-bakers in India, creating a worldwide conversation about this fundamental human practice. Modern science also brought new understanding to ancient techniques. Researchers began mapping the complex ecosystem of microorganisms that make sourdough possible, revealing that each starter contains dozens of species of bacteria and yeast working in perfect harmony. This knowledge didn't diminish the magic of bread making. It enhanced it, showing just how sophisticated these traditional techniques really were. The farm-to-table movement of the early 2000s reconnected bread with its agricultural roots. Bakers began working directly with farmers, using heritage wheat varieties that had been grown for centuries but had nearly disappeared in the industrial era. These ancient grains, emmer, einkorn, spelt, brought flavors and textures that had been lost to modern bread making, creating loaves that connected contemporary eaters to their ancestors. Bakers and food scientists working together discovered that ancient grains like quinoa, amaranth, and teff, grains that had sustained civilizations for millennia, could be combined with modern binding agents to create breads that were not just acceptable substitutes but delicious foods in their own right. The challenge of gluten-free baking pushed the boundaries of bread making, leading to innovations that enriched the craft for everyone. The 21st century also witnessed the rise of global fusion in bread making. As immigration patterns brought together cultures that had never before shared the same neighborhoods, bakeries began creating breads that blended traditions from around the world. In Los Angeles, bakers combined Mexican techniques with Korean flavors. In London, Pakistani naan met French baguette traditions. In Toronto, Ethiopian injera influenced Canadian whole grain breads. This fusion was not mere novelty, it represented a deeper truth about bread as a universal language. Despite the vast differences in technique and ingredients between cultures, the fundamental human need for bread and the satisfaction found in its creation transcended all boundaries. A baker in Tokyo working with Japanese ingredients and techniques shared something essential with a baker in Mexico City, even if their final products looked and tasted completely different. The new millennium, gluten-free frontiers and global fusion. The dawn of the 21st century brought both challenges and opportunities to the world of bread making. As science deepened our understanding of nutrition and health, while globalization connected cultures in unprecedented ways, bread once again found itself at the center of human transformation. The new millennium's most significant bread revolution began not in bakeries but in medical offices, where doctors began diagnosing celiac disease and gluten sensitivity with increasing frequency. For millions of people worldwide, the staff of life had become a source of suffering, and the challenge of creating bread without gluten, the very protein that gives traditional bread its structure and texture, seemed almost insurmountable. Early gluten-free breads were, to be honest, often disappointing. Dense, crumbly, and lacking the satisfying chew of wheat-based loaves, they represented compromise rather than celebration. But human ingenuity, that same force that had first transformed wild grasses into bread 30,000 years ago, rose to meet this challenge with characteristic determination. This movement spread like wildfire across America and Europe. Bakers who had trained in France brought back the secrets of pain de campagne and baguettes, while others explored the sourdough traditions of San Francisco and the rye breads of Eastern Europe. These artisan bakers worked with their hands, shaped loaves by eye and touch, and created breads that varied from day to day based on weather, humidity, and the subtle moods of their living cultures. The rise of artisan bread represented more than just a return to traditional techniques. It was a rebellion against the homogenization of modern life. In an age of mass production and global standardization, these bakers offered something irreplaceable: the human touch, the connection to place and tradition, the acceptance of imperfection as a mark of authenticity. As the 20th century drew to a close, bread had become a symbol of the tensions between tradition and modernity, efficiency and craftsmanship, global culture and local identity. The stage was set for the new millennium, when these tensions would play out in fascinating ways as ancient techniques met modern understanding, creating new possibilities for this most fundamental of human foods. The 1960s and 1970s brought new challenges to bread making. The counterculture movement, with its emphasis on natural foods and traditional ways of life, began to question the industrial food system. Health food stores started selling dense, dark breads made from whole grains and natural ingredients. These breads, often heavy and sometimes barely palatable, represented a rejection of industrial values and a return to more traditional approaches to nutrition. Simultaneously, the women's liberation movement was changing how families approached meal preparation. Bread making, which had traditionally been women's work, became less common as more women entered the workforce. The convenience of store-bought bread became not just a luxury but a necessity for busy families trying to balance work and home responsibilities. The 1980s marked the beginning of what would become known as the artisan bread movement. In Berkeley, California, a young baker named Steve Sullivan opened Acme Bread Company, determined to revive the traditional techniques that had been nearly lost to industrial production. Working with natural leavening and long fermentation, Sullivan and other pioneer bakers began creating breads that connected modern consumers to the ancient traditions of their craft. World War II brought even greater challenges and innovations. In Britain, the national loaf became a symbol of wartime sacrifice and ingenuity. This dark, dense bread, made from flour that included much of the wheat kernel that was normally discarded, was nutritionally superior to pre-war white bread but initially unpopular with consumers accustomed to refined loaves. The war years also saw the rise of fortified bread as governments recognized bread's role in public health. The addition of vitamins and minerals to flour became standard practice, helping to prevent nutritional deficiencies in populations under stress. This period marked the beginning of bread's role as a vehicle for public health interventions. In the post-war years, bread became a symbol of prosperity and modernity. The soft, white sandwich bread that emerged from American bakeries represented the promise of a better future. Sliced, wrapped, and shelf-stable, this bread embodied the convenience culture that was reshaping modern life. Families could buy bread on Monday and still have fresh-tasting sandwiches on Friday, a miracle of food science that previous generations could never have imagined. The development of the Chorleywood bread process in 1961 in England represented perhaps the ultimate expression of industrial bread making. This method, which used high-speed mixing and chemical additives to reduce fermentation time from hours to minutes, could produce bread from flour to finished loaf in under 3 hours. The process spread rapidly throughout the world, becoming the standard method for commercial bread production. This industrial bread was a marvel of food technology, soft, white, and virtually eternal. It could sit on store shelves for days without staling, could be sliced tissue-thin without crumbling, and provided a consistent taste and texture that consumers came to expect. Yet something essential was lost in this pursuit of perfection. The complex flavors that developed during slow fermentation, the varied textures that came from hand shaping, the subtle differences that made each baker's bread unique. All of these were sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. The two world wars of the 20th century had profound impacts on bread making. During World War I, grain shortages led to the development of war bread made from alternative flours, including potato, corn, and even sawdust. Bakers became soldiers of the home front, tasked with feeding nations while working with limited and often inferior ingredients. As the Industrial Revolution gave way to the modern era, bread making stood at a crossroads. The efficiency and scale of industrial production had made bread more accessible than ever before, but at the cost of much of its traditional character and nutritional value. The stage was set for the 20th century's complex relationship with bread, which would see both the ultimate industrialization of bread making and the beginning of a movement to reclaim its artisanal roots. The 20th century, mass production and artisan revival. The 20th century dawned with the promise of progress, and bread making was swept along in the tide of modernization that transformed every aspect of human life. The new century would witness bread's complete industrialization, its role in two world wars, its contribution to the rise of convenience culture, and ultimately, a passionate revival of traditional methods that challenged everything industrial bread making represented. In the early decades of the 1900s, large commercial bakeries began to dominate bread production in developed countries. These facilities, more factory than bakery, employed hundreds of workers and produced thousands of loaves daily. The Taggart Baking Company in Indianapolis, Wonder Bread in Buffalo, and similar enterprises across America and Europe represented a new model of food production that prioritized efficiency, consistency, and shelf life over traditional qualities like flavor and texture. The industrial period also saw the development of new bread preservation techniques. The invention of sliced bread in 1928 by Otto Roeder represented more than just convenience. It was a symbol of how industrial thinking could transform even the most basic human activities. Pre-sliced bread, wrapped in wax paper and later in plastic, could be stored for days without staling, making it possible for families to buy bread less frequently and reducing waste. However, the industrial transformation of bread making was not without its costs. The standardization and mechanization that made bread more affordable and available also led to a homogenization of flavors and textures. Regional bread traditions, which had developed over centuries, began to disappear as commercial bakeries replaced local craftsmen. The wonder breads of the industrial age, soft and white and seemingly eternal, represented both the triumph and the tragedy of industrial food production. They fed millions of people efficiently and affordably, but they also represented a disconnection from the ancient rhythms and traditions that had sustained humanity for millennia. The Industrial Revolution also brought new understanding of nutrition and food safety. Scientists began to study the chemical composition of bread, leading to the development of enriched flours that restored some of the nutrients lost in processing. The discovery of vitamins and minerals revealed why whole grain breads had been so important to human health, even though this knowledge wouldn't be fully applied until the 20th century. In America, the Industrial Revolution coincided with westward expansion, creating unique opportunities for bread-making innovation. The vast wheat fields of the Great Plains, made possible by new agricultural machinery, provided an abundant supply of grain for the growing nation. Railroad networks allowed flour to be shipped from mills in Minneapolis and Buffalo to bakeries in every corner of the country. The American baker of the industrial era was both craftsman and businessman, working in bakeries that were increasingly mechanized while still maintaining the personal relationships with customers that had characterized the profession for centuries. These bakers developed new products suited to American tastes: soft sandwich breads, hamburger buns, and the distinctively American white bread that would become a symbol of prosperity and modernity. One of the most significant developments of this period was the commercialization of yeast. For thousands of years, bakers had relied on wild yeast captured in sourdough starters, a process that was both time-consuming and unpredictable. The development of commercial yeast, first in compressed form and later as dry granules, revolutionized bread making by providing consistent, reliable leavening that could be used on demand. The story of commercial yeast is one of scientific discovery and industrial innovation. In 1857, Louis Pasteur's research on fermentation revealed the role of microorganisms in the bread-making process, laying the groundwork for the systematic cultivation of yeast. By the 1870s, commercial yeast production had become a major industry, with factories in Vienna, Paris, and New York producing millions of pounds of yeast annually. This transformation had profound implications for bread making. Bakers no longer needed to maintain sourdough starters or plan their production around the slow rhythms of wild fermentation. They could mix, rise, and bake bread in a matter of hours rather than days. This speed and consistency made it possible to meet the demands of rapidly growing urban populations. In the smoky mill towns of England, where rivers were harnessed to power great wheels and coal fires burned day and night, the first mechanized flour mills changed the very nature of bread. These new mills, powered by water wheels and steam engines, could produce flour of unprecedented fineness and consistency. The old millstones, which had served humanity for thousands of years, were gradually replaced by steel roller mills that could process grain faster and more efficiently than ever before. The technology of roller milling, perfected in Hungary and then spread throughout Europe and America, represented a fundamental shift in how flour was made. These mills could separate the wheat kernel into its component parts with surgical precision, producing pure white flour that was prized for its appearance and keeping qualities. However, this refinement came at a cost. Much of the nutritional value of the wheat was lost in the process, removed along with the bran and germ that had nourished humans for millennia. In the industrial cities of the 19th century, where workers crowded into tenements and factories operated around the clock, bread became both more available and more removed from its artisanal roots. Commercial bakeries, equipped with mechanical mixers and steam-heated ovens, could produce hundreds of loaves per hour, feeding the growing urban population with unprecedented efficiency. The mechanization of bread making was not without its critics. Traditional bakers, who had spent years learning the subtle art of hand kneading and intuitive timing, watched with mixed feelings as machines took over tasks that had been the domain of skilled craftsmen. Some embraced the new technology, seeing it as a liberation from the physical demands of traditional bread making. Others mourned the loss of personal touch and individual character that had made each baker's bread unique. Dutch bakers in New Amsterdam, later New York, established some of the first commercial bakeries in North America, bringing with them techniques that would influence American bread making for generations. Their focus on quality and consistency helped establish bread making as a respected profession in the New World. As the age of exploration drew to a close, bread had become truly global for the first time in human history. Techniques that had been developed in isolation over thousands of years were now being shared, adapted, and transformed through contact with other cultures. The stage was set for the Industrial Revolution, which would once again transform bread making, this time through the application of mechanical power and scientific understanding. The Industrial Revolution's golden loaves. The rumble of steam engines and the clatter of machinery marked the beginning of a new era in human history, and bread making was transformed as dramatically as any other aspect of life. The Industrial Revolution, spanning roughly from 1760 to 1840, brought mechanical power to the ancient art of bread making, creating possibilities that medieval bakers could never have imagined, while also raising questions about the soul of traditional craftsmanship. The Age of Exploration also marked the beginning of global grain trade. Ships that had carried explorers to new lands returned laden with exotic grains and seeds. Corn from the Americas revolutionized European agriculture, while wheat from Europe transformed farming in the New World. This exchange of genetic material created new possibilities for bread making that would take centuries to fully explore. During this period, bread also became a symbol of cultural identity and resistance. In conquered territories, the imposition of European bread-making techniques often met with resistance from local populations who saw their traditional foods as expressions of their cultural heritage. This tension between innovation and tradition would continue to shape bread-making for centuries to come. The Dutch, master traders and navigators of the era, became particularly skilled at adapting bread-making techniques to the demands of long sea voyages. They developed hardtack and ship's biscuits that could survive months at sea without spoiling, while also creating preservation techniques that allowed fresh bread to be enjoyed even in the middle of the ocean. The encounter between European and Indian bread-making traditions was particularly fruitful. Indian bakers learned to incorporate European yeasts and techniques into their traditional recipes, while European colonists discovered the virtues of whole grain flours and the subtle spicing that made Indian breads so distinctive. This exchange created new hybrid breads that carried the best of both traditions. In Africa, European explorers encountered bread-making traditions that were as diverse as the continent itself. In Ethiopia, bakers had perfected injera, a sourdough flatbread made from teff grain that served as both plate and utensil. In West Africa, bakers worked with sorghum and millet, creating breads that were perfectly adapted to the local climate and growing conditions. The forced migration of enslaved Africans to the Americas brought these bread-making traditions to new lands, where they would blend with European and indigenous techniques to create entirely new food cultures. In the American South, enslaved cooks developed cornbread and biscuits that bore the influence of African techniques, while in the Caribbean, they created breads that incorporated tropical fruits and spices. Meanwhile, in Asia, European traders and missionaries encountered bread-making traditions that stretched back thousands of years. In China, where steamed buns and noodles had been perfected during the Han Dynasty, European visitors marveled at techniques that seemed almost magical. Chinese bakers had learned to create breads without ovens, using steam and fermentation to produce loaves that were both nutritious and delicious. The Chinese tradition of steamed bread, exemplified by mantou and baozi, represented a completely different approach to bread making. These breads, soft and pillowy, were created using techniques that relied on steam rather than dry heat, resulting in textures that were unknown in European tradition. When European traders brought these techniques back to their homelands, they enriched the global vocabulary of bread making with new possibilities. In India, European colonists encountered flatbreads that had been perfected over centuries. Chapati, naan, and roti represented sophisticated approaches to unleavened bread that maximized flavor and nutrition while requiring minimal fuel for cooking. These breads, cooked on griddles or in tandoor ovens, demonstrated that bread making could be both simple and sublime. The 16th and 17th centuries marked a period of unprecedented cultural exchange, and bread became both ambassador and bridge between civilizations. When Spanish conquistadors landed in the Americas, they brought with them not only horses and steel, but also the techniques of wheat cultivation and bread-making that had been perfected over millennia in European kitchens. In the missions of New Spain, from California to Argentina, Franciscan and Jesuit priests established the first European-style bakeries in the New World. These humble structures, built of adobe and stone, became centers of cultural fusion where European techniques met indigenous ingredients. Native peoples, who had their own sophisticated traditions of grain processing and bread making using corn, quinoa, and other local crops, learned to work with wheat while sharing their own knowledge of fermentation and flavoring. The result was a new family of breads that belonged fully to neither Europe nor the Americas, but to both. In Mexico, bakers learned to incorporate chili peppers and chocolate into their doughs, creating breads that carried the heat of the sun and the richness of the earth. In Peru, they discovered that the high altitude required different techniques for leavening, leading to breads that were both light and substantial, perfect for the thin air of the Andes. The tools of the Renaissance baker were works of art in themselves. Wooden peels, carved by skilled craftsmen, bore the marks of generations of use. Stone ovens, built by master masons, represented the pinnacle of thermal engineering. Measuring devices, crafted by instrument makers, brought new precision to a craft that had previously relied on intuition and experience. As the Renaissance drew to a close, bread had been transformed from a medieval necessity into something approaching modern artistry. The stage was set for the age of exploration, when European bread-making traditions would spread around the globe, encountering and blending with local food cultures to create the diverse world of bread we know today. The age of exploration and exchange. As European ships set sail beyond the horizon, carrying explorers to lands that existed only in dreams and legends, they bore with them more than just hope and ambition. In their holds, carefully protected from salt air and ship's rats, lay the seeds of transformation, wheat grains that would take root in foreign soil, sourdough starters that would adapt to new climates, and the accumulated wisdom of European bread-making that would encounter and blend with indigenous food traditions across the globe. The Renaissance also marked bread's entry into the New World. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, he carried with him not only European dreams, but also European grains. The wheat, barley, and rye that took root in the Americas would transform both the Old and New Worlds, creating new bread traditions that blended European techniques with indigenous ingredients. In the Spanish missions of the Americas, monks taught native peoples the art of European bread-making, while also learning to incorporate local ingredients like corn and various native seeds. This cultural exchange created new bread traditions that were neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but something entirely new, a fusion that would enrich the world's bread-making heritage. The Renaissance baker's workshop was a place of both tradition and innovation. Master bakers, many of whom could trace their lineage back through generations of bread makers, worked alongside apprentices who brought fresh ideas and youthful energy. These workshops were filled with the sounds of kneading and mixing, the crackling of fires, and the quiet conversations of craftsmen perfecting their art. Catherine de' Medici, when she traveled from Florence to become Queen of France, brought with her a retinue of Italian bakers whose skills would revolutionize French bread-making. These masters introduced new concepts of leavening and shaping, while also bringing recipes for sweetbreads that would become the ancestors of modern pastries and desserts. The Renaissance period also saw the first systematic attempts to understand the nutritional properties of bread. Physicians and natural philosophers began to study how different types of bread affected human health, leading to the development of specialized breads for invalids, pregnant women, and the elderly. This medical approach to bread making represented a new understanding of food as medicine, a concept that would resurface centuries later in modern nutritional science. During this period, the printing press revolutionized the spread of bread-making knowledge. For the first time, Recipes and techniques could be preserved and transmitted with unprecedented accuracy. The first printed cookbooks, such as Bartolomeo Scappi's Opera dell'arte del cucinare 1570, contained detailed instructions for bread making that allowed techniques to spread far beyond their places of origin. Florence, under the patronage of the Medici family, became the epicenter of bread artistry. Here, in workshops that rivaled the studios of painters and sculptors, master bakers created loaves that were marvels of engineering and beauty. They developed new shaping techniques, creating breads that resembled flowers, animals, and even architectural forms. These decorative breads, served at the elaborate banquets of the wealthy, demonstrated that bread could be both nourishment and art. The Renaissance also marked the beginning of bread's scientific age. Scholars and practitioners began to study the process of fermentation with the same analytical rigor they applied to astronomy and anatomy. They observed how different yeasts affected flavor and texture, how temperature and humidity influenced rising, and how various grains contributed their own unique characteristics to the final product. In the royal kitchens of France, where culinary excellence was becoming a matter of national pride, bakers developed techniques that would influence European bread-making for centuries. They perfected the art of creating laminated doughs, where butter is folded into bread dough to create layers of richness and flavor. These techniques, which required extraordinary skill and patience, produced breads that were as much about technique as they were about taste. The Renaissance of flavor. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, bread making entered a golden age of innovation and artistry. The 15th and 16th centuries brought not only a rebirth of classical learning, but also a revolution in the kitchen, where bread became both sustenance and art form, nourishment and aesthetic pleasure. In the bustling workshops of Renaissance Italy, where Leonardo da Vinci sketched his flying machines and Michelangelo carved marble into divine forms, bakers too were artists in their own right. They studied the classical texts of Rome and Greece, rediscovering ancient techniques while developing new methods that would transform bread from simple sustenance into edible sculpture. The city-states of Italy, wealthy from Mediterranean trade, became laboratories of culinary innovation. In Venice, where merchant ships brought exotic spices from the Indies, bakers created sweet breads studded with raisins and candied fruits. These, pan dolce, represented a new understanding of bread as pleasure rather than mere necessity, a concept that would spread throughout Europe like seeds on the wind. The medieval period also witnessed the development of regional bread traditions that would define European cuisine for centuries to come. In Germany, bakers perfected the art of rye bread, creating dark, dense loaves that could be stored for weeks without spoiling. These breads, with their distinctive sour flavor and keeping qualities, became the foundation of German cuisine and the ancestor of all modern pumpernickel and sourdough rice. French bakers, meanwhile, began the long journey toward creating the perfect white bread, experimenting with different wheats and milling techniques that would eventually lead to the development of the baguette. Their medieval predecessors created pain de chali, a white bread so prized that it was reserved for the tables of kings and nobles. As the medieval period drew to a close, bread had become more than sustenance. It was the foundation of social order, a symbol of religious devotion, and a mark of cultural identity. The stage was set for the Renaissance, when bread would once again undergo transformation, this time in the hands of artists and innovators who saw in this humble food a canvas for human creativity. The medieval baker's day began before dawn, when the stars still held court in the sky, and the world lay wrapped in the gentle embrace of night. By candlelight, bakers would check their ovens, massive stone structures that required hours to heat properly. They would mix their dough by touch and instinct, their hands reading the subtle messages of moisture and texture that determined whether a loaf would rise properly or fall flat. These ovens, built into the walls of houses or standing as separate structures in bakehouse courtyards, were community resources as much as individual tools. After the baker had finished his morning's work, housewives would bring their own prepared dough to be baked in the residual heat. This practice, which continued in some parts of Europe well into the 20th century, created a rhythm of community cooperation that strengthened the social fabric of medieval towns. The Crusades, those religious wars that sent European knights on epic journeys to the Holy Land, had an unexpected impact on bread making. Returning crusaders brought with them new techniques and ingredients discovered in distant lands. They introduced spices that transformed simple bread into something exotic and wonderful, while also learning new methods of preservation that made bread suitable for long journeys. During this period, bread also became deeply intertwined with religious symbolism. The Christian Mass centered around bread as the body of Christ, while the Lord's Prayer asked for daily bread as a representation of all physical and spiritual needs. This religious significance elevated bread from mere food to something sacred, a transformation that can still be felt in the reverence with which artisan bakers approach their craft today. The medieval baker's day began before dawn, when the stars still held court in the sky, and the world lay wrapped in the gentle embrace of night. By candlelight, bakers would check their ovens, massive stone structures that required hours to heat properly. They would mix their dough by touch and instinct, their hands reading the subtle messages of moisture and texture that determined whether a loaf would rise properly or fall flat. These ovens, built into the walls of houses or standing as separate structures in bakehouse courtyards, were community resources as much as individual tools. After the baker had finished his morning's work, housewives would bring their own prepared dough to be baked in the residual heat. This practice, which continued in some parts of Europe well into the 20th century, created a rhythm of community cooperation that strengthened the social fabric of medieval towns. The Crusades, those religious wars that sent European knights on epic journeys to the Holy Land, had an unexpected impact on bread making. Returning crusaders brought with them new techniques and ingredients discovered in distant lands. They introduced spices that transformed simple bread into something exotic and wonderful, while also learning new methods of preservation that made bread suitable for long journeys. During this period, bread also became deeply intertwined with religious symbolism. The Christian Mass centered around bread as the body of Christ, while the Lord's Prayer asked for daily bread as a representation of all physical and spiritual needs. This religious significance elevated bread from mere food to something sacred, a transformation that can still be felt in the reverence with which artisan bakers approach their craft today. The guild system created a hierarchy as elaborate as any feudal court. Master bakers, who had served long apprenticeships and demonstrated their skill through carefully examined loaves, stood at the apex. Below them were journeymen, skilled workers who had completed their training but had not yet established their own bakeries. At the bottom were apprentices, young men who swept floors and tended fires while learning the mysteries of their trade. In medieval London, the Guild of Bakers wielded enormous power, their regulations governing everything from the price of bread to the proper way to knead dough. They established the first quality control measures, with guild inspectors who could fine or even expel bakers who produced substandard loaves. These regulations, while sometimes rigid, ensured that bread remained safe and nutritious for the growing urban population. The medieval period also saw the development of bread as a powerful social symbol. White bread, made from finely sifted flour, became the privilege of the wealthy, while the poor ate dark bread made from coarser meals that often included barley, oats, and even ground acorns during times of scarcity. This distinction was so pronounced that the phrase upper crust originated from the medieval practice of serving the top portion of a loaf to honored guests. In the great halls of medieval castles, bread served functions that went far beyond mere sustenance. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, served as plates for the wealthy, soaking up the juices of meat and vegetables before being given to the poor or fed to hunting dogs. This practice, which seems wasteful to modern eyes, actually represented an efficient use of resources in an age when every scrap of food was precious. In the quiet cloisters of monasteries scattered across Europe, monks became the keepers of bread's ancient wisdom. Their scriptoriums, lit by the warm glow of oil lamps, produced not only illuminated manuscripts but also the first comprehensive treatises on bread making. These holy men, who had dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation, found in bread making a form of meditation, a daily practice that connected them to the divine through the simple act of creation. Brother Thomas, a fictional yet representative figure, might have risen each morning in the Abbey of Cluny, his sandaled feet padding softly across cold stone floors to the bakery. There, in the pre-dawn darkness, he would have checked the sourdough starter that had been faithfully maintained for decades, perhaps even centuries. This living culture, passed from monk to monk like a sacred trust, contained within its bubbling depths the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The monastic bakeries were marvels of efficiency and spiritual purpose. Monks developed elaborate schedules that ensured fresh bread was always available for the community, while also producing surplus to feed the poor and to trade with neighboring settlements. They experimented with different grains, creating rich, dark breads from rye and barley that sustained both body and soul through long winters. Beyond the monastery walls, the medieval world was organizing itself around bread in ways that would shape society for centuries to come. In the growing towns and cities, bakers' guilds emerged as powerful institutions, their members sworn to maintain the quality and fairness of bread production. These guilds, like protective older brothers, guarded their secrets jealously while also ensuring that standards remained high. Egyptian bread was more than sustenance, it was currency, medicine, and offering all in one. Workers building the Great Pyramids were paid in bread and beer, their daily rations calculated with the precision of architects measuring stone. The dead were buried with miniature loaves to sustain them in the afterlife, while the living offered bread to the gods in temples that echoed with prayers and the gentle sound of grinding grain. As caravans crossed the deserts and ships sailed the Mediterranean, the secrets of Egyptian bread-making spread like ripples on still water. The Greeks, those lovers of beauty and wisdom, embraced bread with characteristic enthusiasm, creating their own traditions that would influence the world for centuries to come. In the Agora of Athens, where philosophers debated the nature of truth and merchants hawked their wares, bread sellers offered loaves that reflected the democratic spirit of the city. White bread, made from finely sifted flour, was for the wealthy, while the common people ate darker loaves made from coarser meal. Yet all were united by their daily dependence on this fundamental food, this staff of life that connected the humblest citizen to the richest aristocrat. The Greeks gave us not only the word artos, from which we derive artisan, but also the first systematic study of bread making. Physicians like Hippocrates wrote of bread's medicinal properties, while mathematicians calculated the proper proportions of flour and water with the same precision they applied to geometry. Greek bread was shaped into rings and twisted into decorative forms, transforming the humble loaf into edible art. But it was the Romans who truly elevated bread to an art form worthy of empire. In the bustling streets of Rome, where all roads led and all cultures mingled, bread became the foundation of social order itself. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, acknowledged bread's role in keeping the peace, while the elaborate distrib. Archaeological whispers from sites like Ohalo II in Israel tell us that by 23,000 years ago, our ancestors were already grinding wild grains with stone querns. Their rhythmic pounding creating the first percussion of what would become the eternal symphony of bread making. The evidence lies patient in the earth. Ancient grinding stones worn smooth by countless hands, microscopic starch granules preserved in the spaces between teeth of long-dead humans, silent testimony to this fundamental shift in how we nourished ourselves. As the ice sheets retreated and the world warmed, these wandering peoples began to notice something remarkable. The grains they dropped accidentally near their campsites would sprout the following season, creating small patches of cultivation that followed them like faithful companions. Thus began the gentle romance between humans and grain, a courtship that would blossom into the agricultural revolution. In the soft morning light of the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago, the first permanent settlements began to take root. Villages like Catalhoyuk in Turkey became cradles of bread-making innovation, their inhabitants perfecting the ancient arts of grain cultivation, storage, and preparation. Here, in houses built of sun-dried brick, families gathered around hearths where bread was born anew each day, the smoke from their fires carrying the sweet aroma of baking dough into the endless sky. The bread of these early farmers was dense and dark, heavy with the goodness of whole grains and the honest flavor of hard work. It was sustenance and symbol both, representing humanity's first great partnership with the earth, a covenant written in flour and water, sealed with fire. The golden age of ancient civilizations. As the centuries flowed like honey from the comb, the art of bread-making spread along the great rivers that cradled early civilization. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the Sumerians built their ziggurats toward. The ancient song of bread, a bedtime journey through time. Settle in, dear listener, as we embark on a gentle voyage through time, following the golden thread of bread as it weaves through human history. Close your eyes and let your mind drift across millennia, where the simple act of turning grain into sustenance became one of humanity's most enduring stories. The dawn of fire and grain. In the hushed twilight of prehistory, when the world was younger and wilder, our ancestors wandered beneath star-filled skies that had witnessed the birth of mountains and the slow dance of continents. It was perhaps 30,000 years ago, in the gentle valleys of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, that a remarkable discovery was made, one that would echo through every generation that followed. Picture, if you will, a small band of hunter-gatherers, their hands stained with the juice of wild berries, their eyes keen from years of reading the subtle language of the natural world. They had learned to recognize the golden waves of wild einkorn wheat and emmer that carpeted the hillsides each spring, their heavy heads nodding in the warm breeze like nature's own blessing. At first, these ancient people simply chewed the raw kernels, grinding them between their teeth, tasting the nutty sweetness that would one day become the foundation of civilization. But human ingenuity, like a quiet river, always finds its way forward. Someone, perhaps a woman whose name is lost to time but whose legacy lives in every loaf, discovered that these hard seeds could be crushed between stones, creating a coarse powder that mixed with water to form a paste. The transformation was magical. When this primitive dough was placed upon flat, sun-warmed stones near the dancing flames of their fires, it hardened into something new, a flat, sturdy cake that could be stored, carried, and shared. This was humanity's first bread, simple as morning dew yet revolutionary as the sunrise itself.